Landslides are usually generated by geophysical activity. Earthquakes, avalanches, volcanoes, heavy rainfall, and waves can cause massive amounts of earth to move. They fall into 6 major categories. Flow slides occur when soil and other loosely packed earth flow down along bedrock. Topple slides are when exposed bedrock crumbles away along its fault lines. Slumps are when the earth slides without underlying bedrock. Slides are when rock strata breaks away and slides down an incline. Creep varieties of landslides are when loosely packed earth slowly moves down the side of an incline unimpeded by bedrock. Finally, a fall is when wave action from the ocean, a lake, or a river leads to a crumbling away of an overhang. One thing that all these have in common is the ever-present force of gravity. Landslides can also be caused by human error. This was the case in Aberfan, Wales, on the 21st of October, 1966, when a mound of waste from a coal mine flowed down into the village with disastrous consequences. Aberfan was economically dependent on the nearby Merthyr Vale colliery. The first coal produced there was in 1875. By 1918, the workforce had grown to 2,565. Following the Second World War, the British were eager for change, and they voted in a Labour government which nationalized the coal industry. As of January 1st, 1947, the newly established National Coal Board took over all coal mines and related facilities and properties. The people of the Welsh valleys and other mining areas hoped that this would bring a new era for depressed areas. The National Coal Board assumed control over thousands of acres of tips. These were dumps where waste from the mines was piled high in mountains. Some dating back a century or more, they would be the cause of the greatest domestic tragedy Britain has seen. For many years, waste from the Merthyr Vale colliery had been piled high on the slopes above Aberfan. One of these dumping areas, spoil tip number 7, had been unknowingly placed over a natural spring. At 7:30 a.m. on the 21st of October 1966, after several days of heavy rain, workers noticed that tip 7 had sunk 3 meters overnight. By 9 a.m., it had sunk another 3 meters. By 9:15 a.m., the tip gave way, and mine waste, mud and water started sliding down towards the village. Within 5 minutes, 40,000 cubic meters of rain-sodden debris descended on the village, including the primary school, Penglas Junior School. For years, many people, including engineers, members of the local council, and the head teacher of the school, expressed concern over the safety of tip number 7. 144 people would lose their lives. 116 were school children. Teachers instructed their pupils to go into cupboards to offer protection from the downflow. Later investigations would show that most of the victims died not from being crushed under weight, but from drowning as a result of being trapped. Here are aerial photos before and after the landslide. This oval and map pinpoints the devastated area. Ironically, it was the Friday before the school's half-term break. The children would only be going to school a half day. Had the landslide occurred a half an hour before it did, the school would have been empty. Had it occurred 2 hours after it did, the children would have been on holiday. Virtually every villager ran to the site to engage in search and rescue missions and to try to find survivors in the rubble. Two of the village's chapels were hives of activity. One of them, the Smyrna Chapel shown here, became a staging point and rest area for first responders. Another, the Bethania Chapel, became a temporary mortuary. From all over Britain, undertakers and embalmers volunteered their services and descended upon the village, some driving there through the night. One group from Northern Ireland flew there in an airplane that had most of its seats removed to accommodate stacks of child-sized coffins, while Aberfan buried its dead. The tragedy became world news. Unfortunately, the press was often insensitively intrusive. One photojournalist encouraged a little girl to cry because it would make a good photo. Perhaps this would be the best place to give voice to the survivors. 8 years old at the time of the landslide, Gaynor Madrick's story is very illustrative of what life was like in the coal mining valleys of Wales. Here she appears in her class photo. Her mother had lit a coal fire in the kitchen to warm the house as she got out of the bed she shared with 2 of her 6 siblings. Minutes after arriving at school, she sat down for a math lesson, only to be distracted by a monstrous rumbling noise. As she tried to get up from her seat, a thunderous wave pinned everyone to their seats. She put a foot out to run to the door. Everything went black. Her brother Carl and sister Marilyn will be among those who will lose their lives that day. A heavy radiator which ripped off the wall crushed her leg, but saved her from being suffocated and drowned. Seeing a hand dangling through the wall of an adjacent classroom, she reached for it, only to find it lifeless. To distract herself from the terror which surrounded her, she picked up a book, only to find it bloodied. Then she heard men's voices. One of them was familiar, her grandfather Stan, who was among those trying to dig out the victims. Dug out of the rubble, she was passed from person to person and remembers sirens, chaos, and the bodies of her classmates. She feared the unhappiness of her parents because she had lost her only shoes. She spent 3 months in a local hospital, which had clearly been overwhelmed by the disaster, witnessing the tugging forces of community resilience and mass grief. She, like many, would feel guilty as a result of surviving, often referring to her deceased siblings, but seldom to the tragedy itself. Her parents would become active in calling the National Coal Board to account, but at the time, no one had professional counseling. She still lives in Aberfan. Please read the experiences of other survivors. Here's what other eyewitnesses experienced. The British monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, would visit Aberfan 8 days after the tragedy. Some would criticize her late arrival as a sign of being aloof. I see a mother's face racked by grief. In many ways, criticism of the royal family was unjustified. Early the next morning, the Queen's brother-in-law, Lord Snowdon, would drive to Aberfan to rally the rescuers. At 11 a.m. the same day, the Queen's husband, Prince Philip, arrived by helicopter to view the tragedy. A week later, he would accompany the Queen. They would tour the village and the grave sites with the local mayor. This is a rare photo of Penclass Junior School before the disaster. The Garden of Remembrance was planted over the site of the doomed school. Throughout her long reign, the Queen would visit Aberfan several times, in this case to plant a tree in the gardens. Later, others who played roles in the disaster and its subsequent investigation would also be honored. On her fourth visit to Aberfan, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the tragedy, Queen Elizabeth met Jeff Edwards, who as an 8-year-old was the last living victim to be pulled from the debris. On the northern end of the garden is a playground donated by another traumatized community, the city of Coventry, England. Immediately beyond the playground is the Aberfan and Merthyr Vale Community Centre, complete with swimming pool, gyms, meeting rooms, and many facilities. It provides social, recreational, and medical services. A nearby footpath winds up the hill behind the village. It passes through the community's cemetery. The walk reveals much of Aberfan's history. Humble miners, local notables, and war heroes. It sprawls over many acres. As one gets to the upper parts of the cemetery, the faded gray of old tombstones is replaced by gleaming white memorials. These are the graves of the victims of 1966. Originally limestone, which deteriorated rapidly, they were replaced by white granite. The graves are arranged to mimic the way in which school children would hold hands in pairs when they would go on an outing. I visited Aberfan on a weekday and was surprised to see many visitors putting flowers on the graves, even though they were probably too young to remember the tragedy. Take a bit of time to read the grave markers. They are the signs of a community that has never stopped grieving. Some parents later chose to be buried with their children. As I've noticed, everywhere where I've done my research on mass trauma, naming the victims is important, which is done in many ways in Aberfan, particularly by this cross on the cemetery. In times of tragedy, holy scriptures are often evoked. Throughout the cemetery, benches overlooking the valley provide places for prayer and contemplation, and commemorate those who helped Aberfan in its time of need. Alfred Robins was the chairman of Britain's National Coal Board during the Aberfan tragedy. He had overseen substantial cuts in the industry due to market forces. Like the Queen, he was criticized for arriving late at the scene of the disaster. Chaired by Lord Justice Edmund Davies, a tribunal of inquiry into the disaster placed most of the blame on the National Coal Board. Furthermore, the disaster fund, which had been raised by public appeal, was criticized for misappropriating funds for the removal of the tips, which should have been the responsibility of the board. Many would feel betrayed. Nevertheless, in Wales and throughout all of Britain, tips were removed and stabilized with plantings. The much criticized Robins would later go on to be a champion of occupational safety, ensuring safer conditions for all workers in Britain. Many years later, the government of Tony Blair would restore the misappropriations to Aberfan's disaster fund. From our accommodation at the Mount Pleasant Inn, I was able to view the valley and its now stabilized tips. Ironically, tip number 7 was not some ancient remnant, but was begun as late as 1958. Books, film documentaries, music, and poetry would embed the name Aberfan into the British consciousness forever. For Queen Elizabeth II, it would be the greatest tragedy of her reign. In 2018, the British TV series The Queen featured the Aberfan disaster. The filming of that segment would use extras from Aberfan and surrounding villages. In an interview with The Observer, the creator of the series, Peter Morgan, would reveal how traumatized the community still was. Fortunately, the film crews were accompanied by counselors. The people of Aberfan continue to be grateful for the Queen's relationship with their community, which has spanned generations. However, they were less kindly disposed to the press, whose members often added to their trauma. Since the tragedy, many psychological and social studies have been done of the community. In the 5 years following the landslide, the birth rates of Aberfan and Merthyr are more than double those of surrounding communities. Such a population surge is not uncommon in post-disaster scenarios. This, along with the Herculean effort made to find survivors at the time of the disaster, was misinterpreted as a resilience which simply did not exist. More studies were done as anniversaries of the tragedy passed. Researchers revealed a terrifying picture: early deaths, people unwilling to leave their homes, and some not allowing interviewers to close doors. Only 41 of 145 survivors agreed to take part in a study 33 years after the tragedy. It concluded that children are affected by traumatic events in a way very similar to adults. They are not necessarily more resilient. Post-traumatic stress disorder was apparent in almost all the participants. As time passed, so did many of the personalities involved in the tragedy. The mayor, local councilors, fundraisers, legal advocates, and what were then heroic young teachers. The National Coal Board was dissolved in March of 1987, and the coal industry was privatized. The area suffered another setback when the Murthervale Colliery closed on the 25th of August, 1989. My wife and I went to Aberfan in 2014. After visiting the sites associated with the tragedy and its memorialization, we took a walk around the center of the village. It was deadly quiet. There were few people in the streets. All the pubs had long been closed, and the co-op supermarket was shuttered. Only a few corner shops remained. After leaving one, we passed a bank, which was due to be closed the next week. There were no restaurants or hotels, and most places of worship had long been abandoned by their congregations. It was ghostly in a way I have never seen. Behind closed doors, there was suffering. Tragedy had triumphed. The busiest place was the cemetery. Less than 4 years after the Aberfan tragedy, on the other side of the world, an even greater disaster faced the people of the Ancash province of Peru. Not as famous as Machu Picchu, Cuzco, or Lima, the Ancash Valley is a beautiful area which divides the Andes. To the east are the Cordillera Blanca, or White Mountains, a stunningly beautiful area which is well known by hikers and mountain climbers. Peru is part of the Ring of Fire, a geologically active zone which contains most of the world's earthquakes and volcanoes. The 1970 Ancash earthquake lasted for around 45 seconds and measured 8.0 on the Richter scale. Its epicenter was in the Pacific Ocean, 22 miles off the Peruvian coast. The tremors caused severe damage and loss of life. Its aftereffects were particularly felt in the inland town of Yungay. High in the Andes above the valley, snow and ice were shaken loose around Mount Husqvarna as it flowed down the slopes, and even some cases flew down the slopes. It gained speed, and with it also other debris. In 4 minutes, the landslide traveled 14.5 kilometers, or approximately 9 miles. This would have meant it was traveling 220 kilometers per hour, or 137 miles per hour. 3/4 of the way down the mountain, a ridge funneled it in the direction of Yungay, resulting in an unparalleled tragedy. Obliterated by the avalanche and landslide, only a handful of Yungay's features survived. This billboard-sized map shows what the old town looked like prior to its destruction. Only fragments remain. The facade of a church, the wall of a cinema, and the wreck of an old bus. The lightened area of this panoramic photo shows the extent of the physical destruction. The provincial capital, Juarez, was reduced to rubble, and the coastal town of Casma was shaken to the ground. However, human losses were even more stunning. Adding up the totals of both the earthquake and the landslide, more than 74,000 people were killed. Another 25,600 were declared missing. Over 143,000 were injured, and more than 1 million were left homeless. The population of Yungay was concentrated. The earthquake struck around 3:23 p.m. Some rushed to the church to pray. However, many more were grouped around televisions and radios for the World Cup match between Italy and Brazil. Of Yungay's 25,000 people, only about 400 survived, 300 of whom were children who went to a nearby village for a circus. They would all become orphans. This relief map of the Ancash Valley shows the area affected. Near the right-hand edge of this inset map, the source of the avalanche is shown with a triangle. The destroyed town is shown by a number 2, while New Yungay, the rebuilt area, is shown with number 1. One frequently visited site in the old destroyed town is the Camposanto, or cemetery. Sadly, many of its mausoleums and terraced walls were destroyed by the earthquake. The cemetery's Swiss architect, Arnoldo Ruska, died in the landslide. Completely rebuilt, Yungay's Camposanto has become a place of pilgrimage. In 2020, I was scheduled to speak at the 50th anniversary of Yungay's disaster. Unfortunately, another tragedy, COVID-19, prevented me from traveling there. Let's reflect on what we have seen. In the dark Welsh Valley on the mountainside lay the little children close to where they died. Their little lives are ended before they reach their goal. Tender little children have paid the price of coal. Yungay is an impressive example of resilience. It is easy to sit back and compare Aberfan's hundreds of victims to Yungay's tens of thousands. Yungay's complete destruction led to the building of a new community with few ties to the past, whereas Aberfan continues to be surrounded by the memories of the disaster. Yungay's tragedy can be attributed to forces of nature, whereas Aberfan's is much more unforgivably that of human error. Special significance is placed upon the death of children, which was particularly the case in Aberfan. I encourage you to recognize all suffering, regardless of its scale, rather than compare human tragedies. Mass trauma is not about death tolls or monetary loss, but rather what happens to the human soul.